Good evening, everyone. Tonight I'd like to continue our discussion, delving a little bit more into what the author of The Cloud of Unknowing has to say about spirituality. I've been kind of indirectly referencing up to this point his works, but tonight I want to in particular talk about a couple of the images that he puts forth and what he's trying to accomplish in this incredible piece of work. One of the things we need to realize is that ultimately prayer is always about relationship. And it's a relationship obviously with God, but also a relationship with ourselves and other people. Prayer is never just a one-way street. Its goal is to restore unity to the relationships in our lives and enhance them. So as we seek out a relationship with God, the end result of that search ought to be a greater embrace of God's presence, a better understanding of God's presence in my life as God is working in the world, as God is working in other people. Often, as we're journeying through life, someone will say, "Please keep me in your prayers." Or so-and-so in my life is struggling with a particular problem, whether it's an illness or maybe they're going through some stress in life, they've lost their job. Keep them in your prayers. Given what we've talked about so far up until this point, what does that ultimately mean? What are we actually requesting of someone when we ask to be remembered in their prayers? Well, ultimately, if we step back to what we started out saying in the first week or two of our journey here, prayer is not about convincing God of anything. Jesus makes it very clear in his teaching that God already knows what you want before you ask him. So there's no need then to convince God through sheer numbers of pounding heaven to listen to one particular request over another, if God already has things in his care. So when I'm asked to pray for someone, or I want someone to remember me in their prayers, ultimately what I'm asking, really, is to open up a relationship. You want to be included in their sacred space, in their love space, in the sense that that can be achieved. Because prayer is about relationship, it's really about opening the doors and the pathways of love. And when you get right down to it, the most unique, special place of ourselves is that place where we are, in essence, in touch with God, our soul, our inner self, the inner depth of who we are. And so when we remember someone in prayer, we're including them in that bigger dimension of ourselves and opening up the pathways of love. And love has power, and love can change. Think of human relationships, and you'll get a glimpse of what I'm trying to discuss here. Think of your relationship with your spouse, or your relationship with one of your kids, or with an extended member of your family, a close friend. When you say, "I love you," is the power of that sentiment conveyed in the saying of the word, "I love you"? Or is it also communicated in the expression of that word, "I love you"? So in other words, I can tell somebody I love them. I can show somebody I love them. And you kind of need both in order to accomplish what love can produce. So when I say to somebody spiritually, pray for me, what I'm actually saying is, remember me in that special sacred place of yours. And in doing so, the power of that love, the power that's engendered in that sacred space, is not limited to your physicality. Neither is love. You can't show the love you have for your spouse in an empirical way. Oh, here, put it on the table here. That's the love I have for my spouse. Or here's the love I have for my son or daughter. It's bigger than that. It takes on a greater dimension to that. So when I say the power of prayer, think the power of love. And you can then begin to understand what is meant by that terminology and that sentiment. When I begin to open myself up to God and create that space in my life, what I'm opening myself up to is the building and the restoring of a relationship with the one who made me. The one who made me. When I begin to pray and I begin to meditate and to reflect upon myself as a person, as is reflected in Scripture or as I journey through life, I'm actually opening up the doorways and the pathways to a deeper relationship with myself. When I journey into self-knowledge and I begin to understand myself better, where I've come from, what my weaknesses are, what my vulnerabilities are, what my strengths are and my gifts, as I begin to investigate that part of myself, I begin to open up and restore a relationship with myself. I can do this well, and I need to work on that. Once I identify the things I need to work on, as I work on them and as I grow, the relationship with myself heals. If I'm a person who is very revengeful, angry, bitter, once I understand why I'm that way and what is going on and begin to change some of those habits and those understandings, the relationship with myself changes. It builds. It heals. The Englishman in The Cloud of Unknowing makes it a big point of saying, love heals. Love heals. The relationship I have with others also, through the power of prayer, can change and can build. If I'm having trouble communicating with someone, again, my spouse, or a conflict at work, or with one of my kids, or with someone who's special to me, if I'm having a hard time sharing what is going on inside of me, through prayer, I can come to understand myself and what I need to do to change those habits, to change those dynamics, to be more open. You see, let's face it, once we start building the relationships in our lives, once I start to work on my relationship with God, once I start to work on my relationship with myself, then my relationship with others is going to change too. You take a person who's very defensive. As soon as you begin to even slightly criticize, the wall goes up. Well, why is that happening? Because obviously, whatever is going on is touching a place within them that drastically needs to be healed. Well, once they can figure that out and begin to take the steps to heal that through the power and presence of God as well, then they don't need to be defensive anymore, and it doesn't bother them as much. So prayer is all about relationship. It's establishing relationships. It's realizing that I'm not just a biological being. I'm not just a physical being. I'm a spiritual being. And just like I share space with you physically and psychologically, emotionally, I also share space with you spiritually. When 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst, tells us that there's a spiritual bond that happens with folks who believe. And that power, just like the power of emotion and the power of physical touch, can heal. It can heal. It can change things. You know, it's a big difference, even physically. If somebody is hurting, to sit there and just keep your hands like this and listen. We all know just putting your hand on someone's shoulder and touching in a physical sense very simply can make a world of difference in terms of how you're received and what the gesture of your action communicates. The same thing with prayer. Pray for me. To seriously take that to heart opens up that spiritual connection that I share with you and brings you into my sacred space and me into yours. Is it about convincing God or moving the chess pieces on the board? No. It's about opening up a relationship. The Englishman influences a lot of spiritual folks. Another one that emerges around this same time is a fellow by the name of Meister Eckhart. He's a little bit more difficult to comprehend than the Englishman is in The Cloud of Unknowing. But ironically, the other day I came across a card that I had purchased, and the quote from Meister Eckhart on it fits so well to the discussion tonight. And he says this: "There's a place in the soul that time cannot touch." Listen to that. There's a place in the soul where time cannot touch. Last week we talked a little bit about the propensity we have and the disposition we have toward eternity, that there's this piece, this part, this essence to ourselves that's not limited by time and space, that part of us that grows in wisdom and develops and matures and gets better with age, rather than the rest of us that tends to decline with age. And so there is that place within us that is timeless. Once you discover that about yourself, you begin to open up your spiritual self in ways that you may never have thought of before. When you begin to see the eternal within you, then you begin to see life in a different way. You're much bigger than who you thought you were before. And there's a greater depth to you than who you thought before. Because now life takes on a sacred character to it, which is, by its nature, its truth. Its truth. The Englishman, in this cloud of unknowing, what he's actually trying to do is help folks who really want to live the contemplative life. He's trying to show them the way and to almost be like a spiritual director to them. What's interesting about it is, as you read through his work, you never get a sense that he's talking as a master. He's not talking as the one who has done this perfectly. He's truly being prophetic, and I truly believe being a vessel for how God wants us to relate to God and what that all means in our life. And so he's very practical, and very simple, and very direct. And he has this way of clearing through all of the nonsense and getting right to the heart of the matter, the truth of the matter, and focusing our attention where it ought to be. So as he writes, and as you read through, if you ever get this book and try to digest it, very simple, very direct. And as you're reading this, you're saying, my goodness, he wrote all that time ago. He's talking about today. So he's pointing to things about human nature that transcend the centuries. Because as much as we've developed over the last several hundred years, we've also stayed the same. Life has changed in so many ways, but there's so much about us that has not changed. And there's a unique character to a human being that transcends time, and he kind of gets into that a little bit and is able to give us some direction. He makes a big point of telling us, and I've mentioned this before, that God can be loved, but he cannot be thought. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about St. Thomas and the Summa that he wrote, and all the volumes of thinking about God doesn't touch God, that God can only be loved. And as I said, that is the purpose of prayer, to open the pathway of love to God. He can be touched by love, but not by concepts. So the Englishman is more into less thinking and more loving, less thinking and more loving. And once we begin to discover what it means to love, and of course I'm not talking about a romantic love here, I'm talking about what in Greek we call an agape love, a brotherly, sisterly love, a bonding love. Once I understand what love is, then there's a beauty that's seen in life that radiates that's not there before. So then when I look at a flower, or I look at a piece of creation, or an animal, or another human being, there's again, a sacredness about them that I may have missed without that ability before. And then he brings people into a very interesting place. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit because I think it's something that we always wrestle with, our faults. We often get confused when we start using the word humility. You know, we hear it thrown around all the time. Be humble, be meek and humble of heart. What does it mean to be humble? What does it mean to be a person of humility? For most of us, I think, we go back to our sins. And we think to be humble means to have a sense of sinfulness, that I need to know how I have made mistakes and how I have not lived up to the mark. And once I have a sense of that, then I can accept how you're not living up to the mark and you're not living up to the mark, and it makes me more humble. You know, that a person, for example, who has suffered is forced into humility because of their suffering. That somehow there has to be a very painful experience in order to become humble. Well, the Englishman kind of backs off from that whole concept and that idea, and he says, no. He says, think about yourself for a moment. There's a part of us, and you can sense it right now if you look within yourself, there's a part of us that brings joy and gratitude. So, for example, you may think of something you accomplished. You may be sitting next to your spouse whom you adore. You may have had wonderful experiences with your job, or you think about the relationships that you have with your kids, and you think about living life in general. You get up on one of those spring days that's coming soon, and you just wake up and you just feel connected. You know, you go up on a high mountain and you just get struck with awe about the beauty that's around you. We've had these experiences. We have them all the time. And you step back from that, and so there's a huge experience of joy and gratitude to being a human being, to being in a particular place at a particular time. The Transfiguration, we just heard that gospel a couple of weeks ago. Jesus is up on the mountain. His disciples are there. What do they say? Lord, it is good to be here. It is good to be here. Joy and gratitude for our existence. But then, there's a part of us too, when we begin to think about ourselves, that is the source of agony. And I'm not talking about the agony that comes from failure. I'm not talking about that kind of agony. I'm not talking about the kind of agony that comes when we want to go from A to B, but we goofed up and we ended up being stuck back at A again, and we didn't succeed in what we set out to do, and we feel guilty. I'm not talking about that kind of agony. I'm not talking about the kind of agony we experience when we don't live up to somebody's expectations, or the kind of agony that we experience when I've hurt someone, or the kind of agony that I've experienced because I'm physically not well. I'm not talking about that kind of agony. The kind of agony I'm coming to discuss, and the one that the Englishman points out, is kind of an existential angst. Big fancy word, existential angst, which is a condition of our lives that reflects our incompleteness. Think about this just for a moment. A condition of our lives that reflects our incompleteness. So, for example, he says that humanity in general is not yet whole. We are still becoming. We are still growing. No matter what we try to do, humanly or divinely, here on earth, we are never going to be put together perfectly. Not now. We are always in a process of becoming. Letter to the Corinthians, all creation groans and is in agony even until now. We've heard that passage many, many times. The groaning of creation, the becoming of creation. So the angst, or the agony that the Englishman says is spiritually healthy, is not the one that comes from looking at what we didn't do or could have done or should have done and messed up. No, that's unhealthy. The healthy agony comes when I realize that I still have a long way to go before I reach my truth, before I'm really brought whole. And when does that happen? That happens with the resurrection. That happens in the life to come. So while this joy and this gratitude that comes from living and being human, there's also this angst or this agony because we're not finished yet. God is not done with us yet. We're not whole yet. And as a result of that lack of wholeness, as a result of that broken condition, things still need to be fixed. And we're going to trip up over ourselves. But the thing is to not get stuck over the fact that we've tripped or even the consequences of tripping. Refocus and look at where you want to go. Now that's important. So the Englishman says there's these two dimensions. So he says, until the resurrection, our personality, our true self, is incomplete. This imperfect state of incompleteness, isolation, and separation from our goal is the basic source of our existential anguish. Anguish that arises not because of his existence, but because of his separated existence. So ultimately, we want to be and need to be connected with God. We need to be and ultimately have to be connected with God. And if we're not 100% connected, we're going to feel separated. And it's a very basic, true point if you accept the fact that God made you. Okay? So, this separation, this angst, this agony, is what he defines as true sorrow. Now think about that, because that sadness that arises from the fact that I really want to be connected more with the person whom I desire, my God, is a source of sorrow. Again, let's bring this back to human relationships. In your human relationships, things happen. Communication breaks down. You hurt one another. Whatever's going on inside of you individually sometimes spills over into your relationship between the two of you and even your extended family. Your own needs, where you are as a human being, where your relationship with your spouse is at that particular time, or with whomever you find yourself associated, may need some fine-tuning and is not as fulfilling as it could be. And so you spill over. And when you realize that my unfinished self, my negative self, my imperfect self has hurt you, wounded you, affected you, you feel sorrow. Well, the same is true with our relationship with God. The fact of the matter is that this incompleteness, the fact that it's not together yet the way I want it to be or could be, produces sorrow. The Englishman said this is a healthy sorrow. It's fundamental, and it's also more conducive to humility than just sorrow for one's sins or anything else. So that's where the wonderful gift of prayer and discipline come into play. Because he says it's through developing that habit of prayer, that habit of connecting, that habit of loving, that I begin to focus on my truth. I begin to become more concerned about bringing the separation that exists closer together to unity. That I keep myself focused on the goal that is my life and not get caught up in the things that happen in this world. He makes it a big point in his writings to tell the folks to pursue their course relentlessly. And what he means by this is it's easy to give up in our spiritual life because sometimes it's just not feeling the way we may think it ought to be feeling. Or we may not be seeing the fruit that we may think we should be seeing. And so perseverance is really the rule of thumb when it comes to developing a relationship with not only God, but ourselves and one another. If we think the road is going to be easy, it's not. And not only in terms of God, but the road to ourselves, the road to one another, is always challenging work. I think it goes back, to our first session together when we talked about the gifts of the desert and what going out into the desert did for folks. Well, it's not until you're stripped of everything for a period of time that you really begin to realize the resources that are inside, and you begin to grow. You know, if we have the cushions all over the place, we're not so apt to grow. And so pursue the course relentlessly. And he gives some wisdom, which I think all of us can really use. I know I can, because we beat ourselves up too much. He says, attend to tomorrow and let yesterday be. Never mind what you gained so far. Instead, reach out to what lies ahead. Stop beating yourself up over your past. Forget what you did, what you didn't do, what was done to you. Your past hurts, especially what people did to you, and your failures are of absolutely no use to you. Listen carefully to that. Learn from your past and move on. Move on. But see, we don't do this. We keep remunerating and going over and rethinking and overthinking and reliving and re-going in, and we just get into this whole negative place at a time when we can't do anything about that anymore. You know, if I'm constantly worried and concerned about something that happened to me when I was 6 years old, no matter how horrific it was, and I'm fixated on what I didn't get when I was 6 years old, or when I was 10 years old, or what somebody did to me when I was 12 years old, and the abandonment that happened to me when I was 13 years old, whatever the excuse is or the thing in your life, what good is that serving you now at this stage of your life when you're 40, or you're 50, or you're 90? Nothing. All it's doing is keeping negative, hurtful energy in a space that could be more positive if we change our focus. So he says, dwelling on it only keeps you stuck and miserable. My little caveat on that is that in many cases, some people like being stuck and miserable for a couple of reasons. It takes you off the hook of responsibility, and that's the big one. I'm stuck, I'm miserable, I'm angry, and I'm depressed because of what happened when I was 6, when I was 8, when I was 12, when I was 14. So I'm going to sit home and I'm going to be angry, miserable, stuck, and depressed. Okay. I'm going out for dinner and I'll see you later. But you can stay home and be angry, miserable, stuck, and depressed. I'm going to enjoy myself. And so the point is that sometimes folks rather be stuck and miserable than deal with themselves and move on and become creative and functional and blessed and loving and back on course to what they can do with the wonderful gifts that God has given them in abundance in their life. So, we like to blame this so we don't take responsibility for that. He says, if you wish to keep growing, you must nourish in your heart the lively longing for God. That's it. If you wish to keep going, you must nourish in your heart the lively longing for God. I don't have it today, but I can have it tomorrow. That's a positive statement, because tomorrow is there and the possibility exists. If I say, I didn't have it yesterday and I probably don't get it today and I know I won't have it tomorrow, that's a negative statement. I don't have it today, but maybe I can get it tomorrow. Lively longing for God keeps God in the focus, and the unity that's going to happen when the blessed resurrection becomes a part of my existence when I transition from this life to the next. And so it keeps us focused, it keeps us on the goal. The fact that I have that separation and that I am still not totally connected with the God of my desire produces a true sense of sorrow in my heart, because that's what I want to achieve, but I don't have it yet. And that makes me humble. And that makes me humble because I realize I'm still on the road. Not humble because I'm such a miserable person, hating myself and others for all the sins that I committed. That's not why I'm doing it. And it's certainly not out of guilt. It's because I know what I want to achieve. I know where I want to be. I'm not there yet, but I want it. And I know that's where I have to go. The only one God needs is you. And all that he asks of you, according to the Englishman, is for you to fix his love on him and let him alone. Prayerfully seek his strength. He says, this is what you are to do. Lift up your heart to the Lord, with a gentle stirring of love, desiring him for his own sake and not for his gifts. Center all your attention and desire on him, and let this be the sole concern of your mind and heart. Lift up your heart to the Lord. Now, here's where people get confused. And he makes a big point in this thing, because the folks at the time when he was writing thought that in order to be a prayerful person, in order to be a contemplative person, they had to devote copious amounts of time to this contemplative work. And so they thought in their heads that the more they thought about the saints, and the more they thought about Our Lady, and the more they thought about the attributes of God, and the more time that they spent reading the scriptures, and the more time they spent saying the prayers, and the more time they spent in solitude, and the more time they did this, and the more time, that this was going to produce greater contemplative fruit. The Englishman says, no. All that stuff is good, but in terms of connecting you, it's useless. Because all it takes is lifting your heart to God. Lifting your heart to God. And he said, this is not time-consuming. It is not time-consuming. In fact, it is as quick as an atom. Fleeting moment in time. Think, for example, back to the analogy I used when I started tonight, about being somewhere and feeling connected. Feeling connected. You're out taking a walk, and you're in the mountains, or you're on the ocean. I know there's some people here who love to go on walking on the ocean and just having a sense of God's beauty as they do that, and a sense of connectedness with something around you. Maybe it's walking and you see a squirrel, and all of a sudden creation just kind of clicks, or you're with an animal friend of yours, and you just feel a part of everything. Those moments of connection are not 9 hours long. It's boom. I feel that sense of something other than myself. I'm lifted from this place and brought over there, if only for a moment. Right? Well, prayer is that way too. We're not looking for hours here. We're talking about lifting one's heart in humility to God, if only for a moment. Only for a moment. To fix one's gaze, one's glance, where it's supposed to be. And to look to God for the strength. The strength. As I mentioned, he said, it's by the work of this contemplative love that we are able to engender that man will be healed. Failing in this work, he sinks deeper and deeper and further from God and more into sin. But by persevering in it, he gradually rises from sin and grows in divine intimacy. So the more we're attentive to this, and it's just, and I said it in the beginning when we started, spirituality is about awareness. It's awareness. Once I'm more aware of what's going on around me, of who I am as a person and where my attention is supposed to be focused or can be focused, things begin to change. They change. And by persevering in this work, in trying to understand ourselves in the way that God sees us, we begin to change, and we become less of a victim to sin and alienation, and we find ourselves drawn more fully into the truth of who we are and focused on where we're supposed to be going. So he says, then be attentive to time and how you spend it. Now here's the problem with our technological age. It's so easy to waste time. Flip the channels on the TV, get the gadget out and see what the internet is doing. You have a couple of moments, let me go on. Everything is computer, this, that, beep, bop, bop. Okay, well, and I know this myself. Sometimes I'll say, let me just take a break from work and I'll go on the internet, I'll step in. What did I just accomplish? Zero. Absolutely nothing. Be attentive to time and how you spend it. And the Englishman says, this and alone will bring you to a better place. He said, time is for human beings, not human beings for time. We tend to run the clock. Oh, it's 12 o'clock. I got to get ready. I got an appointment coming in, blah, 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 blah. Oh, gee, I got this to do tonight. I got to squeeze this in, bump, 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 bump. Who's serving who? Okay? We need to change that attitude in our lives. I was talking with Lisa today in the office and how the world has just become so different than it has been even 40, 50 years ago. And there just doesn't seem to be any more time to do anything, I want to just skip ahead a little bit because in the interest of time, we get talking here and... You got that? What I'd like to do is focus us where he goes with an analogy, and it's an interesting thing. And the more I read this particular passage, the more I realize the wisdom of it. And the way it's centered in Luke's gospel is very, very interesting too. Let me read it for you. You'll recognize it right away. But he uses this particular scripture as a way of unfolding his understanding of human nature, and it's really kind of cool. On their journey, Jesus entered a village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who seated herself at the Lord's feet and listened to his words. Martha, who was busy with all the details of hospitality, came to him and said, "Lord, are you not concerned that my sister has left me all alone to do the household tasks? Tell her to help me." The Lord, in reply, said to her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and upset about many things. Only one thing is required. Mary has chosen the better portion, and she shall not be deprived of it." What's interesting about that particular passage, because we hear it always in that context, we don't often go back and see where it's situated in its original context. It's actually preceded by the story of the Good Samaritan, in which Jesus delivers the instruction, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul," and then begins to talk about who is your neighbor and unfolds our relationship with one another in its proper context. Then comes this Martha and Mary story. which unfolds this dynamic between two sisters and their relationship with Jesus, who's in the center of that whole scene. What follows the Martha and Mary story is Jesus' very simple teaching on the Our Father, which is then followed by two parables on prayer. So in the context here is a whole development on prayer and its various dimensions. So if you really want to understand Martha and Mary, you've got to understand the context of the other stuff that's going around it, because Jesus is kind of rounding out the whole thing in these teachings here. They're coming together in one way to form a picture of where we need to go. He uses this particular story to describe you and I on our journey of life. You know, it's very easy to look at Martha and Mary and say, Martha's wrong, Mary is wrong and Martha is right. Jesus is over there for dinner. Martha's doing the cooking. Martha's doing the cleaning. Martha set the table. And here's Mary sitting at Jesus' feet kind of gazing up at him. Get off and start helping me. You know, that's the normal reaction. You're not right. You know, we have him over here, and you're sitting there doing nothing, okay? And we tend to criticize Mary for that. But then when Jesus gets on the scene, he says she's chosen the better portion. Now Martha's not looking too good in the whole picture. But actually it's both. It's both. And the Englishman says you kind of need both. And this is almost like an analogy for how we view life. And he says it this way. He says, there's a journey. We all start off in what he calls the lower active state. Lower active state. And what is this? This is you and I attending to the details of life. Attending to the details of life. If we haven't come to belief yet, the really base, low active state would be dealing with the mundane, everyday stuff of life. Getting up, taking care of what needs to be done, going to work, going to school, attending to the details, and meeting a certain amount of success in the relationships and things that are going on around us. That's very base. But the lower active in terms of the spiritual life is when I get up, I do what I have to do, I say my prayers, I try to be a good Christian, I try to live the gospel, I try to be as good of a Catholic as I can be, I obey the rules, I do what I have to do, okay? And I go about my existence, okay? I say a little rosary here and there. I say my morning and my evening prayers. I go to Mass, okay? Lower active life. That's dealing with the fundamentals of what it means to be a Christian, okay? Then as a person begins to grow, they move from that lower active life. That's Martha, okay? Martha is dealing with all the stuff that needs to be dealt with, oblivious to who the Lord is, oblivious to what his significance in her life is, oblivious of what he can do for her. She's got to produce the meal, okay? A worthy cause. Jesus needs to eat, but it's the lower active, okay? As we move and as we grow, we then can, if we choose to, through development of self-knowledge, move to a higher active position in life. And what is this? That's when I begin to meditate on what I'm doing. I begin to become more interior. I begin to know myself a little bit. I begin to understand the world a little bit more. I begin to understand who God is and what God's role is for me, and the fact that I'm not just a passive bystander, but an active participant in a whole process here of conversion, of growth, of meditation, and of development, okay? So that this now higher active is the person who begins to take their spiritual life a little bit more seriously, who begins to reflect and see more to life than just what may be apparent, who moves beyond doing things just for the sake of doing them, to embracing the truth behind them and the greater reason for doing them. So in this whole progression, he says, we begin to meditate on the things of the Spirit. And this is when we ought to ponder not only the sinfulness of man, so as to enter into the passion of Christ and the sufferings of his saints with pity and compassion, but it's when the time when one grows in appreciation of God's kindness and his gifts and begins to praise and thank him for the wonderful ways he works in all of his creation. And so as we begin to grow in this higher active life, we begin to develop a sense that we're not alone in this whole picture, that we're guided by a presence, and that presence is around us. We begin to see the giftedness of one another, the giftedness of creation, in the wonders of God. And so out of spontaneity, we may find ourselves saying, thank you, God, for the gift of yourself, the gift of each other. As we move in this higher active, we now can move into what he calls the lower contemplative. And now we're getting into Mary. Mary was not concerned about any of the particulars. If you listen to the scripture, she simply sat there. She didn't even really care who Jesus was. She wasn't busied about trying to understand him. She wasn't asking him any questions. She just sat there in admiration of who he is. And all she wanted to do was be in his presence, period, in simplicity. Okay? That really is the image of the contemplative life. To become gifted with the state of just simply wanting to be in the presence of God. Now, as you and I journey through life, and we journey into that higher active state that the Englishman talks about, we can, in our busyness, get glimpses of God. We can touch God in those moments of connection, in those moments when we truly, in our heart of hearts, cry out in love for our Creator. And we can develop this awareness that allows us to see the abounding presence of God more clearly. You and I are not called to be a full contemplative, living away from the things of this world in a monastery somewhere. Many people are. But for those who are not, glimpses of God are not beyond our reach. They come when we begin to develop our sensibilities and our awarenesses, when we come to know who we are and who each other are a little bit more. When we begin to meditate on ourselves as part of something bigger than just what we see in the mirror, and when my focus changes from what I didn't do or should have done in my past to where I want to be in my future, when I begin to realize that it is this desire within me, ultimately, even though I don't always recognize it or name it as such, that is moving me on and bringing me towards something greater than myself that will one day complete me, and that it's my desire to be completed, and the fact that I am not now, that produces a sorrow and a longing for that which I really ultimately want and desire. And so the Englishman kind of pans out this whole scenario in a very eloquent and simple way to direct us on this road that would bring us to a better place. He says, the activities of the lower degree of the active life in themselves leave much of man's natural human potential untapped. At this stage, and this is the lower, he lives, as it were, outside of himself, or he even uses the word beneath himself. And that's true. That's true. A lot of folks in this life, in our life, you and I even, don't live our fullest potential. We don't. We use time and busyness and schedules as an excuse, but we're often living below our potential. And we live beneath it. And we never really tap into what we really could be or could become. He says, as he advances to the higher degree of the active life, he becomes increasingly interior, living more from the depths of himself, and becoming, therefore, more fully human. He doesn't use this word, but it is apropos to what he's trying to describe. The human being becomes more sensitive, more pliable, more in touch. And in becoming more pliable and more in touch with themselves, they become more pliable and more in touch with the person next to them, the one person next to them. He says, but in the higher degree of the contemplative life, he transcends himself because he achieves by grace what is beyond him by nature. For now he is bound to God spiritually in a communion of love and desire. So the person who achieves that higher state, that one that we probably won't get to in this life, but can certainly find in the next, is the one who is then bound to God in such a spiritual way that there's just something at their core that cannot be separated from him. He says, and this is kind of interesting, one loving, blind desire for God alone is more valuable in itself, more pleasing to God and to the saints, more beneficial to your own growth, and more helpful to your friends, both living and dead, than anything else you can do. So what he is saying here is if in our course of our life we can clear away things even for just a moment and find that loving, blind desire for God alone, that one simple, small act has more significance and power than anything else we can do. He said, of course, it is impossible in this life to see and possess God fully. But with his grace and in his own time, it is possible to taste something of him as he is in himself. He says, the work of love heals the roots of sin, and when the roots of sin are healed, he says it produces what he calls practical goodness. Practical goodness. So in other words, as we begin this process and we work in prayer, which is the work of love, which is the work of coming to understand ourselves and God and each other more, we then heal all that sin has created. And when we heal, it makes us genuinely good. Genuinely good. And you can see that in people. You meet these folks that are just genuinely good. And they don't have to work at it. And they don't have to put a facade on. It just flows. And he says this genuine or practical goodness is a matter of habitually acting and responding appropriately in each situation as it arises, moved always by the desire to please God. If done well, this is evident in the case of two virtues in particular. So in other words, if a person undertakes this task and does it well, you're going to see two things in them. The first is humility, and the second is brotherly love. Humility and brotherly love. Whoever acquires these habits of mind and manner need no others, for he or she will possess everything. And when is a man or a woman humble? When he or she stands in the truth with a knowledge and appreciation for himself or herself as he or she really is. He would see clearly the degradation, the misery, and the weakness of the human condition, which results from original sin. From these effects, man will never be totally free in this life, no matter how holy he becomes. And he would recognize the transcendent goodness of God as he is in himself and his overflowing, superabundant love for man. The humility engendered by this experiential knowledge of God's goodness and love, I, the Englishman, call perfect, because it is an attitude which man will retain even in eternity. So what he's basically saying here is once we begin to understand who we are, and once we begin to take the focus off what we didn't do, should have done, could have done, and what has been done to us, and focus on the road that we're supposed to be on, the one that starts now and moves toward the future, because the past is over and only the future is left. Because when you stop and think about it, there's not even a present. Because as soon as we capture the present, it's already the future and already part of the past. So to say live in the present moment means absolutely nothing. We are always on the road to the future. And so once we have that in mind, and once we begin to live in that journey, we then begin to heal through the virtue and work of love that sinfulness that we have within, the effects of sin. Makes us genuinely good, which produces humility. And humility really is just an understanding of who I am in my truth. And then, once I have that posture in here, I begin to develop what we call character or virtue. And it's those things that when we leave this life are brought with us. Not the bank account, not the house, not the clothes, not anything other than what we've done with our soul. That comes. So what does it mean to be happy? We get confused about all of that. He doesn't say this, but one can infer it from what he has to say. True happiness, then, is found when we discover and when we nurture those things that can travel with us to eternity. It's not about getting things. It's about discovering and nurturing those things that can travel with us to eternity. You know, if you've ever gone on a vacation and you have to pack a bag, what do you absolutely have to bring in order to get the bag so you don't have to pay extra on the plane? Well, you figure that out. And you go through all your drawers and you say, oh, I can't take that, but I can take this, and you put this, and then all of a sudden you come with a bag. And that is what's going to suffice you for that journey, for that trip. Well, we got to think of our spiritual lives in that same way. What are we doing with our spiritual baggage that's going to need to be packed at last minute when we don't know it's coming? You know, life ends and we're going, where's the suitcase and what's in it? And so the interior piece is what's going to make us happy here. And if you look at people who are genuinely happy, you look at somebody like Mother Teresa, and you really get down, you can look at all the details of her life, but when you saw her interact in her ministry, she was genuinely just a happy woman. It didn't need much. Well, that's the kind of thing, that he's getting at. He says, do not shrink from the sweat and toil involved in gaining real self-knowledge. For I'm sure that when you have acquired it, you will very soon come to an experiential knowledge of God, God's goodness, and God's love. He says we cannot force the contemplative call. It is not our choice to become Mary. We cannot force it, and we can't create it ourselves. Mary became so enamored with the Lord's divinity that she scarcely noticed the beauty of his human presence as he sat there before her, especially as he sat there speaking and teaching. She even became oblivious to everything else. Mary was unmoved by Martha's criticism. She should care less whether Martha had to do all the stuff or not. This whole incident concerning Jesus and the two sisters was intended as a lesson for active and contemplative persons of the church in every age. Mary represents the contemplative life, and all contemplative persons ought to model her in their lives. Martha represents the active life, and all active persons should take her as their guide, each learning from the other to the extent that they're able in their station in life. So the active person can look to Mary for glimpses of what they can become when they have the opportunity to be taken out of their active world. And the contemplative can look to Martha as what they need to do to balance their life when they need to do things in the active world. And so, therefore, in that one little scripture story, we have a wonderful blueprint for what it means to journey through our human spiritual lives. Basically, to become a person who is on the journey of prayer requires creating space. Creating space means developing discipline. And discipline can be as easy and as simple as simply tending to certain things during the course of my week, of making sure that I create the sacred space necessary to at least dispose myself to spiritual things, to things of God. It doesn't mean that I have to take a chunk of an hour out of my time, go to my sacred space in the house, sit down and shut all things out. We don't necessarily need to do that all the time. But it does mean saying that there are certain things that I'm going to call myself to by hook or crook each week. Attending Mass is one of them. At least trying to keep myself on some kind of schedule for the spiritual life so that I can develop a habit of coming to God. Even creating spaces for solitude, for worship, and for personal prayer. Once I begin to develop a discipline in my life, I can then embark on the task of prayer, of taking and spending time with my spiritual self, of listening to the Word of God revealed in Scripture, of becoming more attentive to the God who abounds in creation, of listening more carefully to my brothers and sisters as I interact with them on a daily basis, to open myself to greater possibilities, to do all in my power to forget what has happened to me, what I didn't do, could have done, should have done, and focus on where I am and what I can do today and tomorrow to get where I need to go. And once we have that focus and once we have that vision, then God can go in and do what God does best, helping us achieve it by giving us the virtues and the love to achieve those goals. He may not rearrange the furniture in our lives or make everything go our way, but he certainly can give us the equipment and the ability to move along that journey just nicely by ourselves. And with that wonderful spiritual strength and courage, we can accomplish the goals of the gospel, and we can focus on the eternity to come and bridge that gap of separation that exists between our incomplete and our soon-to-be complete selves, where we will one day rest completely in God and find ourselves for who we are. So I hope that the last couple of weeks have been helpful to you. It's kind of a daunting task to summarize all of this into 3 short sessions, but if there's been at least a couple of little images, a couple of little things that maybe have clicked that may help you in your search and your journey for God, then it's been a success. And realize that our spiritual lives are works in progress, never to be completed here on earth, never to be perfect. Only when we enter into heaven will we see things as they truly are. But we can, by God's grace, get glimpses along the way. And if we can get 1 or 2 of those, we're good. We're good. So thank you very much, and you can get up and stretch, and we'll get together in a couple of minutes for our evening prayer. You're welcome. If anybody did not get a Lectio Divina sheet from last week, it's here.